The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Leon Charney Report. We have a really eclectic and exciting show tonight.
My name is Raviv Drucker. I'm the political analyst for Channel 10 News in Israel, and I'm also the host of an investigative program called Amakor, or The Source. I don't want to make any prediction about the length of life of this government, because we saw in Israeli politics that it's almost impossible to predict the future. I would say that it's a government that entered its cadention in a very sour taste for most of the Israelis and for the ministers themselves. Very narrow coalition, the narrowest possible, 61 out of 120. A lot of internal battles inside the governing party, which means the Likud, between the senior ministers there. One of them, number one in the Likud list, stays outside of the government. So a lot of bad taste, a lot of bad blood for this government to begin with. Many of the coalition agreements that puts this coalition together includes all kinds of reforms that most of the public really dislike. Reforms that comes for the ultra-Orthodox public, but on the expense sometimes on the other parts of the Israeli population. So all of these things, I think, perceived as not a really good start for the new government. I would say that since it happens, last Thursday, we see that the battle escalates between Erdogan and the Prime Minister, which means the Prime Minister fired the General Manager of the Telecommunication Office, which Gilad Erdogan appointed. And afterward, Gilad Erdogan said he will initiate a new law that was perceived to be against the Prime Minister policy. So we saw a bit of escalation between the two sides. Of course, there are politicians. In a week, in a month, they could do something else. They could do some kind of agreement of entering the government. But right now, it doesn't look good in the terms of their relationships. I knew that Erdogan hesitated about this thing for many, many months. Even in the previous government, 2013, he was very disappointed by the position that was offered by the Prime Minister, and he was hesitant whether to take it or no. And I think that the fact that the Prime Minister did not offer him the position of the Foreign Minister, even though Mr. Erdogan was willing to promise that the moment Mr. Herzog will enter the government, I will be willing to leave this post, it proves more than anything else that Mr. Netanyahu doesn't want to build anyone in his party that could be kind of competition for him in the future. And Mr. Netanyahu very well know that to have someone as a popular foreign minister, it can build him as a future candidate. So probably he doesn't want it, and this is why he leaves this very important office in his hands instead of giving it to one of his senior ministers. First of all, as far as we know, he was never offered to join the government. Maybe there was some secret channel that we were not aware of it, but as far as we know, there was never an offer fact to be right, it was never the case. I mean, Netanyahu did not call Herzog, did not offer him to join the government seriously. So he said that maybe in the future, but there was not real offer. And I think that even if there will be an offer, and even if Mr. Herzog himself will want to join the government, he will face very, very major difficulties to have his party's approval to this kind of entry. Because right now this government looks like something that will not last for long. I'm not saying this will be the case, but this is at least the image, the general perception. So for somebody who is the head of the opposition to enter a government in order to save it from collapsing, it's almost impossible. If Netanyahu will be able to stable the government, the coalition, and it will look like something that will last for long, for years, so maybe. It will take me probably 20 hours to explain how much Mr. Netanyahu is a difficult person to work with. He's a bad manager, according to almost all of his subordinates, including the most loyal ones. His record proves that he has almost, I don't want to say zero, but very few people were able to stay with him for a very long time. Mainly his relatives, people like his lawyer, David Shimron, or his other relatives, the lawyer Yitzhak Molcho, but most of the rest, people that work for him in his office, advisors, secretaries, ministers, MKs, almost all of them in some point couldn't stand it for much longer. I was saying that it starts with his work style. He's a person that can decide one thing in the morning, the complete opposite decision during the evening, and reverse it again next morning. Sometimes he will not coordinate with you all these changes in policies, so you look ridiculous. You're going to the media, you defend his decision from the morning until the evening. You suddenly realize that it's the other way around. So this is one thing, and sometimes it goes to the fact that, like we spoke about this former minister Erdan, that the senior people in his party around him get the feeling that he will never let them grow, that there is some kind of a glass ceiling that they can never break, because he will never appoint them to the most senior position, and will always keep them in kind of position that they cannot compete with him. So all of these factors, and I can think of many others, are part of the fact that people around him usually after a while separate from him. I have no doubt that Mr. Netanyahu has all the intention in the world to keep on going as a prime minister as long as he can. Look, I don't think anyone in Israel, even Mr. Netanyahu himself, ever thought that he will be second only to Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Israel, in the number of months he serves as prime minister. I believe, if I remember the numbers right, Mr. Netanyahu is already 111 months as prime minister. Mr. Ben-Gurion served 159. So if Netanyahu will finish this kadention, he will probably will be ahead of Mr. Ben-Gurion as the #1 survivor as prime minister in Israel. So to predict his end is, I think, will be very much arrogant thing on my part, and I would never do that. First of all, because as we said earlier, he doesn't let them to grow to a position, to a status that they will look like competition. They never held the post like foreign minister or so forth. Second, and I can completely agree with it, when you are part of the ruling party and you are winning and you are in power for the last 6 years and you have at least 4 years ahead of you, why to change your golden card? He's the leader. Maybe you have a lot of reservation towards him, but still he is the leader. He is bringing the victory. He brought 30 seats to the Likud in the last election. I can fully understand why they still vote for him. President Rivlin said a lot of things during his short cadention as a president that was completely contradictory to what Mr. Netanyahu did or said. President Rivlin spoke against Mr. Netanyahu's statements about Arabs going to vote in the election day. President Rivlin spoke against a narrow government. President Rivlin spoke against some of the coalition agreements. He spoke against many of the things that Mr. Netanyahu did. He didn't speak against Mr. Netanyahu personally, but this is a line that he will obviously would not want to cross. But he said a lot of things against Mr. Netanyahu policy and statements. I think that the scenario that there will be a resumption of the bilateral direct talks between the Palestinians and the Israelis are slim, almost zero. I think that Mr. Netanyahu proved to himself that he doesn't need it anymore in order to rule. Back in 2009, he thought that it's a crucial condition for him to stay in power, to keep a good relationship with the world, to have this negotiation, even though there will be no positive results, at least the negotiation. Now we saw that he has no negotiation, he won the election, and he somehow keeps some kind of room to maneuver in the world. So I don't think he has a great motivation to do that. On the other side, I can't see Mr. Abu Mazen withdraw from his condition to negotiation, like freezing all the settlements activity or commitment to the 67 lines as the border between the two states. So I can't see those two horses together in the same room. About Mr. Lieberman, no doubt about it that Mr. Lieberman wants maybe more than anything in the world to kick Mr. Netanyahu out of the Prime Minister office. It's almost like this metaphor that he is willing to take one of his eyes out as long as he can cause some damage to Mr. Netanyahu. The fact that he stayed out of the government in the last minute proves more than anything else what he thinks about Mr. Netanyahu's performance as Prime Minister and about their personal relationship, which are very, very bad, and it's saying the least. But it's a really big question whether he can do that. I mean, he has only 6 seats in the Knesset. Netanyahu has 30. His approval rating in the general public is very low. His credibility was eroding dramatically during the last year or two. He needs to build himself almost from bottom. I'm not sure he can do that. In Israeli politics, everything is possible, even this kind of bonds between Mr. Lieberman, that represents mainly the immigrants from Russia, and Mr. Bennett, who is representing more of the right-wing voters in Israel and the religious people. But at least for the time being, those two persons really hate each other, Bennett and Lieberman, almost as much as they dislike Mr. Netanyahu. So to see them join forces together against Mr. Netanyahu when one of them is in the coalition, Mr. Bennett, and one of them is in the opposition, Mr. Lieberman, right now, it's hard to see that. But I started and said that it's Israeli politics, almost everything is possible. Maybe in the next, in 6 months or a year or two, it can happen. As far as I know, Mr. Netanyahu has a lot of worries regarding the pressure from the world, the process of delegitimization by the international community against Israel. But he is trying to maneuver between the demands of his coalition, the right-wing coalition, and the world. And sometimes he goes to that direction, and sometimes he goes to this direction. For example, this day that we are shooting this interview, he called the defense minister and asked Mr. Ya'alon and asked him to postpone or to reverse his decision for separation in buses in the territories between Arabs and Israelis or settlers. So this is absolutely a step to kind of reduce the international pressure on Israel, because he probably knew for a fact that Europe will be outbursts in anger against Israel for this decision. So he's trying to maneuver between the pressures. And 6 years until now, he succeeded. Maybe he will succeed for more. Mrs. Netanyahu, unfortunately, has a lot of influence on her husband. I'm saying that it's unfortunate because I think it's completely legitimate that a wife or a spouse will influence her husband. But in this case, I think that the influence is for very negative directions because of her character and all kinds of problems that she has with herself. And I don't think we need to elaborate on those problems. We do need to elaborate on the influence, because we see sometimes the schedule of Mr. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, changes rapidly because of all of these things that happens in his house. We see the people surrounding him that influence deeply by her demands, her questions, her decision. We see sometimes major things in his policy influenced by her. The identity of future coalition members, the identity of the president, even other pillars of his policy sometimes influenced by her. We had a lot of difficulties to convince the public, probably, in what I'm saying right now. And the ultimate proof for it is the fact that he won this election in a landslide. So we failed in convincing the public how much this problem is huge. But the fact that we lost in convincing the public doesn't mean that it's not the truth. This is the truth. And tens of people around him that were there or still there are telling us about it every day. Unfortunately, they are not brave enough to say this to your camera, but they are saying it.
Welcome to another Leon Charney report, and who do we have with us today? Yuval Steinitz, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, the most important committee in the Knesset in the State of Israel, and we are in Tel Aviv interviewing him. And we couldn't be here at a more propitious time. The United States is at war in Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction are problems all over the place. Yuval Steinitz conducted a tremendous report on the internal workings of the Mossad and the Army and the intelligence forces, and we'll talk to him about that. And on top of everything else, Yuval is a member of the Likud Party, and the Likud Party is pretty well split today between the camp of Bibi Netanyahu and Arik Sharon. And many of you saw our interview last week with Ruby Rivlin, and we went into depth about the possibilities there, and we don't know how that will work out. Obviously, this is being taped before we know the conclusions. Yuval, welcome to the show.
Hello, Leon.
You're a very bright guy and a man who studies foreign policy and defense, and you're the chairman of a very, very important committee. The Iraqi war, did it affect Israel at all?
Yes, the entire region. It's still too early to know the final consequences, but I think there were until now, two major consequences. First, we got rid of Saddam Hussein, and this was quite a relief to the entire region. Saddam Hussein put direct threat to Israel, but not just to Israel, to Kuwait, to Jordan, to Saudi Arabia, and to his own people. And he also supported Palestinian terrorism, Hamas, Jihad, Fatah, against us by sending money to suicide bombers' families.
Right.
So it's good to get rid from such a threat. And another extremely important result, maybe even more important result, was that Libya. Libya, Gaddafi dismantled his nuclear capacity, his nuclear industry, and they were quite close to achieve nuclear weapons, like the Iranians approximately, maybe even slightly closer. So paradoxically, you failed to dismantle chemical weapon in Iraq, but following the war, you succeeded dismantling much more dangerous and threatening nuclear weapons in the region in Libya. So this is important, and now we have to wait and see what will be next in Iraq and in the entire region. It's too early to say.
All right, but the Mossad is a pretty intelligent intelligence operation. You people were scared when that war broke out, let's say. You know, it was normal. You didn't know what kind of nuclear, or if he had nuclear weapons, if he could hit Israel. I mean, the duty of your intelligence people was to check to see whether he had that ability. What did your people think? That he had that ability or he didn't have that ability?
You speak about Saddam Hussein now.
Yeah, Saddam Hussein.
We shifted back to Saddam Hussein.
Right, what the Mossad thought the day before the war. You people, I think, were giving out antidotes and even gas masks. Did you people think that he had weapons of mass destruction?
Let me be very clear. We conducted very thorough investigation committee and investigation to the military intelligence and Mossad in following the war in Iraq, and also with regard to Libya. And it was clear that our intelligence services, both the military intelligence and the Mossad, were quite confident that Saddam Hussein do possess weapons of mass destruction prior to the war. And I think it was 2 days before the war, they even reported us and the government that they estimate it highly probable that he will attack Israel with such weapons. We found that those were only estimates based on very little, very dull information. And our criticism of our intelligence services was not so much for the estimates, because we saw the estimates were quite reasonable, taking into account Saddam Hussein's past and behavior and things that looks like he got something to hide. But our main criticism was why we had to estimate at first place. We suppose our intelligence services to know and not just to estimate, to bring hard facts, solid information. And concerning Iraq, this was not the case with our intelligence services, and also with American and British intelligence services.
Yeah, but it's very interesting that the President of the United States, George Bush, could have reasonably felt that that he got good intelligence from the British, from the Israelis, it's a very important point. It's a political point at this point, not a defensive point.
No, but what I do emphasize is that we, due to the reports we got, were pretty sure that Saddam Hussein is hiding weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons. We didn't know about quantities, but we were quite certain about it. The estimates seems to be very solid. And today we know that we didn't know for sure, and we didn't have enough solid information. It was estimates, very reasonable estimates. Although they were probably wrong, but very reasonable estimates.
I'm sure it was. You know, UN Resolution 1441, you're familiar with that, which prohibited that stuff and condemned him because he didn't allow the inspectors to come in. So it's not unreasonable to expect that that was the case.
And taking into account his behavior in the past, yes.
Right.
He was cheating, and he even used chemical weapons against his own people.
So at the end of the day, before that war, Israel, in a sense, because of the Mossad and your intelligence people, would be prepared for possible chemical weapons.
Yes, yes. I can tell you that 1 or 2 days before the war, the military intelligence this time reported us that they estimate it as highly probable that Saddam Hussein will attack us with chemical warfare. So it was quite reasonable to make the necessary preparations. But
by the way, do you define a weapon of mass destruction as chemical warfare?
Look, this is a really good question, because actually we are putting all weapons of mass destruction in the same basket.
Right.
And you have to make clear division or distinction between chemical and even biological warfares, which are extremely dangerous, and nuclear weapons. This is a different opera. This is a devastating threat, and therefore I'm saying that it was more important to dismantle Libya from its nuclear industry, from its nuclear capacities and ambitions, than to dismantle somebody, even like Saddam Hussein, from chemical weapons. And clearly, Libya would not dismantle itself unless unless Gaddafi saw that America is extremely serious about Saddam Hussein and about preventing weapons of mass destruction.
We did a two-part series with the founding dean of Harvard Kennedy School, Graham Allison, on weapons of mass destruction. And it was our contention with him that unless that is the most serious problem in the world today, because it's flexible, you can move it around. And he wrote a book about it now in a way to deter it, which will become, I think, one of the most important books accepted both by George Bush and by Kerry. No matter who becomes the president, I'm sure that he will be involved in that process, and he's apolitical. The key to good intelligence, though, is having people on the ground. And I think what happened, at least in the United States, was they depended too much on technology. And I can't go beyond what you say publicly, but it's really important for the audience to know that he did a massive investigation of the intelligence services here, and that's not easy to do in Israel, because they're prima donnas in a way, the military and the others. And Yuval was very stern, and I hear a lot of comments from a lot of people that you have changed the ability of that committee to function well. I heard it only from you, not only from you, but from a lot of people. So we have to commend you for that. On the other hand, you're in a very sensitive area, and you got to be very careful. So, what did you conclude that's public about that report that you got? That your services were a little bit defective, or what was the conclusion?
No, the conclusions were first quite similar, in a sense, to the conclusions by similar investigations committees in the United States and in Britain. First, that we have to strengthen the human intelligence, that you cannot trust only technology, even if you have the state-of-the-art technology, SIGINT or satellites and so on and so forth, this is not sufficient. You have to create, and this is not easy, human intelligence, qualitative human intelligence in addition. We had some other conclusions about the need for the political echelon, and especially the Prime Minister, to have tools not just to listen and to learn from the intelligence services, but also to oversight them and to direct them and to, in a sense, even to challenge them, to criticize them, to direct them to the most important missions from national security point of view, and not just from the IDF point of view or from their own point of view. This is important. We recommended a special intelligence advisor or secretary that will help the Prime Minister, that will be in the Prime Minister office, and some structural changes, including shifting some authorities and also some resources from the military intelligence into the Mossad in order to be able to detect nuclear proliferations and nuclear efforts around the globe. They were also in the public report. Now I'm only quoting the public report.
Well, if you want to give us the private report, we'll take it.
No. But also some recommendations about priorities, and we emphasized that nuclear threats and secret nuclear attempts or industries or connections in the Arab world should be first priority, and we should invest more on this and maybe less on other issues, even like terrorism or like conventional, regular intelligence. For us, it was even more overwhelming or surprising and devastating, the failure in Libya, because we knew that something is going on in Libya, but we didn't know the right scales of Libya nuclear program until it was discovered by the CIA and the British MI6. And this was main part of our investigation, because this should not happen again, and not at first place.
So basically you came to the same conclusion that the American Congress did, that the American Congress now wants to make a cabinet officer in charge and meld all the intelligence services, because there's conflict, there's territorial conflict. Did you see the same thing between the military and Mossad?
First, no. We didn't say that they have to be really melted, but that the political echelon need to have the tools, mainly the Prime Minister, to direct the different services to their missions according to his priorities. This is important.
He can't do that today?
He can do that today, but maybe he lacks the tools to oversight, to decide the priorities, to decide about building of the intelligence forces. And therefore we recommended that there will be a special secretary for the Prime Minister on intelligence, and even confidential and ministerial committee that will oversight the intelligence services like we do in the Knesset, in the parliament.
Yuval, if the Menachem Begin, when he made the strike, was that totally his decision? That is totally the Prime Minister's decision if he wants to take out a nuclear plant, or does he have to go to a Knesset committee, get approval?
No, it was totally for him to decide.
It's his decision.
Yes, but I think he consulted.
Well, I'm sure he consulted
with not just with
the opposition,
with the professionals, but with two people, with a chairman or with the head of the opposition, then Shimon Peres, and I think also with the chairman.
He was against it, by the way.
Yes, and also I think with the chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee.
Which would be you, in today's business.
In today's business, yes.
Heavy responsibility.
Well, it is a heavier responsibility to decide, not to be consulted with.
No, but it's very interesting that the prime minister alone can make that decision, and a prime minister could start a nuclear war. I mean, it's it's a reality. I mean, you see novels about this, but it's true. But it's the same with the president of the United States. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the president of the United States, whether he has to go to the Senate, one of the committees. I think he may just have to inform them. But he can't start a war without the approval of Congress. On the other hand, so there's an indirect play here. It's really interesting.
No, look, also here, if you want, for example, to start a war and you need to draft the reserves, the reserve soldiers in Israel, you need the approval of the committee.
Of your committee?
Yes. I think after 1 or 2 days you have to have the approval of the committee.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that.
But usually, in our case, our adversaries starts war with us and not vice versa. So there is no question of
you know, last interviews,
Yuval,
you were not very happy with Egypt. Are you still same position, or are you a little bit more encouraged by the way they're moving, especially maybe in Gaza?
Well, I'm not encouraged at all. Maybe I can be slightly encouraged by their declarations or rhetoric willingness to help the Palestinians to prevent terrorism. But still, it is more important to see what they are doing on the ground. And on the ground, if to be very modest, we can say that they are not doing enough to prevent terrorism and to prevent arms smuggling from their territory to our territory or to the Gaza Strip. And if to be bold and clear, we can say that if you don't do everything in your capacity to prevent the smuggling of arms and bombs and explosives for terrorists, and you enable terrorists like the Hamas or other terrorist organizations to transform your land, Sinai, to their logistical base, actually you support terrorism. I must tell you, Leon, honestly, there is no much difference about this between Syria and Egypt. Syria helps the Hezbollah or enables the Hezbollah to get weapons in Lebanon, through Lebanon or through Syria. Egypt helps the Hamas to get weapons and explosives from Egypt. The only difference is that the Syrians are explicit about it. They're doing it explicitly, and they are proud about their support for terrorist organizations, and the Egyptians are tacit about it, and yes, and they are saying we are against terrorism, but what can we do? But on the ground, there is no much different. Both countries support terrorism against us, and I hope that United States can pressure Egypt to stop their support for terrorism, to block Sinai, and to prevent the smuggling of so many guns and arms and explosives for terrorists. This is extremely important. You succeeded with the Saudis. It's partial, but important success to pressure them not to allow so much money to terrorist organizations.
You have support for that?
What?
You have support? You've seen...
Yes. There are some restrictions now in Saudi Arabia that make it more difficult.
Because there's a movie out called Fahrenheit 9/11, and Bush is criticized by being too pro-Saudi Arabian, but many think that that's really a propaganda film, and it has...
no, I can tell you that in the last 2 years, United States put a lot of pressure on Saudi Arabia to prevent money for terrorists, And there is partial, but still significant success. I do hope that exactly like you did with your friends, your allies in Saudi Arabia, you will do with your friends in Egypt. Egypt is receiving more than $2 billion annually.
I think more.
From the United States, I said more than $2 billion. And you can at least request that Egypt will cease its support for terrorism. Because if you enable terrorists to use your land to transform arms and explosives, this is vital support for terrorism. And if in your media, including your government-controlled media, the media do legitimize terrorism, even if it is mainly against Israel and against Jews and not so much against the West anymore, this is an important support, and the United States can stop it by pressuring Egypt.
Number one, your prime minister talks to Mubarak and he does not talk to Assad. And number two, your chief of intelligence meets with the chief of intelligence in Tel Aviv of the Egyptians. So the one thing we know is that at least you have a line of communication.
This is important.
Very important.
But it's not sufficient.
All right, we got to cut for a break, Yuval. We'll come right back and we'll talk to you about a happy subject called Iran and their nuclearization program, which could be very, very dangerous to the state of Israel. We'll be back. We're back. I'm Leon Charney. We're in Tel Aviv, Israel. We're interviewing Yuval Steinitz, who is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, the preeminent and most important committee, obviously, in the country, because this country is concerned always with foreign affairs and defense. One of the problems irking, and it's a bad word, irking, one of the problems festering around this area and the world is the fact that Iran is starting to use its muscles and talk a lot about the fact that they have nuclear energy or preparing to have nuclear arms, etc., and everybody who reads a newspaper knows about it. The question is, and they're making virulent statements against the state of Israel, the question is if they're playing chess with Israel in a way to get their population revved up against the Western world, or if they really are saying they're going to talk about destroying Israel, but what they're really doing is threatening the Western civilization. And I think no one is better informed to talk to us about that than Yuval. Yuval, you know, you hear the threats every day about Iran against Israel. They want to wipe you out, and they're close to developing some nuclear weapons. Your theory is that the West should take care of these guys because those weapons can hit London and Paris and all the Western countries. And obviously the United States should be concerned because we care about non-proliferation. So should Israel take this whole business about Iran very seriously?
I think everybody should take it extremely seriously.
I agree, but
for a variety of reasons. First, one should understand that the Iranian nuclear program is extremely ambitious, much more ambitious than North Korea or Pakistan. If they will produce the first nuclear bomb, and then they will be out of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, according to American sources, they will be able to produce approximately 20 bombs annually, which means that Iran's goal is to become not a regional nuclear power, not just to build few bombs to keep in the shelters or to deter its, to threat its vicinity, but to become a global nuclear superpower with hundreds of bombs and with very long-range missiles. They already got us under the range, and now they develop and they invest a lot of money.
Let me ask you a silly question.
Missiles to the ranges of Berlin and London.
All right. Why would they want to do that?
Well, look, I think...
It sounds silly, but the investment is enormous. They have a lot of problems economically. There are a lot of poor people who live in Iran. It has to be either a strategic aim or it has to be a religious aim. So, do you know? I mean, it sounds
strategic
simplistic.
and religious. I think there are three reasons.
It sounds simplistic, but I think you and I can discuss it, you know?
I think there are mainly three reasons. First, they want to, they do compete for leadership in the Muslim and even in the Arab world, although Iran is not an Arab country, but they are Middle East oriented. And if they will become nuclear, clearly they will be able to become leaders of the Middle East, of Arab and Muslim countries, and to export the Iranian revolution under the nuclear umbrella to countries, to other countries, to force them to accept, like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, like Kuwait, like Iraq, like Syria, even Egypt. Secondly, they do hate the West. And they do hate Israel because Israel is a clearest manifestation of the West, of the Western civilization, of the democratic world in the Middle East. And they do hate Israel because Israel considered to be part of the Western world. But they do hate the Western civilization. They do think that there should be only Islamic civilization, and that the Western civilization, and especially the United States, all the more so United States, is a threat to Islam, a threat to the Islamic Republic of Iran. But and just let me finish with the third argument. The third argument is the preservation of the regime. It is clear that dictatorship or such a totalitarian regime with nuclear capacities will be more stable regime than without it. It's help for the stabilization of such totalitarian regime against internal enemies and also against external enemies.
All right, but we have interviewed a lot of people who've been to Iran, and Elaine Chelino, who's a New York Times reporter, wrote a book called 100 Faces of Persia. We interviewed a fellow for Forbes magazine who came back and said that he expects a revolution in Iran because the youth in Iran defy these ayatollahs. There is an underground life, totally westernized. You have parties, discos, internet. The whole system in the youth is totally different than what the ayatollahs are doing today. So there is a feeling by these people that there could be an interior revolution by the youth. And you know, there are more youth there than there are old people. You don't get that, huh? You're not hearing that at all.
No, I am not optimistic. Many people develop hopes about the reformists and reformist revolution in Iran until a year and a half ago, but nothing.
Now the Ayatollahs control. Khatami is the president, yes. He's elected, he has certain powers, but the Ayatollahs control.
Let's put it like this. If Iran will become nuclear, it will be more difficult and more unlikely that such a reform or even a revolt or an uprising will take place. But therefore, and for other reasons, and for the reasons that you cannot predict what those ayatollahs will do with nuclear capacity, you cannot build on mutual deterrence between, for example, the United States or NATO and the ayatollahs. They already said that they can suffer several million casualties without difficulty, unlike the West and unlike Israel. So I would say that it's better for the Middle East, for Israel, for United States, and even for Iranians, that Iran will be prevented, and that this problem will be seriously addressed by the Western world and mainly by the United States of America.
The New York, the International Herald Tribune had an article here 2 days ago which inferred that Arik Sharon might do a preventative hit against the nuclear possibility or nuclearization of Iran, and that's a very worrisome thing to him. This was a history professor at Hebrew University, I don't remember his name, but this obviously appeared all over the world. Do you think that Israel would ever, in a sense, that would be a very, very difficult thing to do, because wouldn't that absolutely put a war here? I mean, do you think? I
don't know, but in any case, I think that it's not up to us to solve this problem. Unlike Iraq in the 80s, this is a global problem. This is a global threat. The Iranians are building missiles, and they invest a lot of money in it. With the ranges of Europe, they already got us in the range of their missiles. Now they are building missiles with ranges of 4,000 and 6,000 kilometers. And I think that it's up to, to NATO and to the United States to solve this problem, and not for minuscule Israel.
Yuval, we're out of time. I'm sad because it's always fascinating to talk with you. Arik Sherman will get a copy of this tape, so will George Bush. I think this may have an effect on both their lives.
Thank you, Leon.
As always.
My pleasure.
Keep going.
Thanks.